And we are live. Hello and welcome to Fermenting Opinions. I'm your host, David Papiden, and this is Fermenting Opinions, the podcast in search of a more palatable political ferment. And today, also theological ferment. I am joined by Dylan and Jaylen of the Identity Christ Is podcast, as well as my brilliant and talented girlfriend, Janie, who's come here to sit in on the conversation. Topic being morality. I think we wanted to start off by discussing which worldview, whether it's atheism / naturalism or Christianity, is the better explanation for why we have moral systems. Perhaps is that Jaylen Dylan? Is that about right to you guys?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, if you want to refine, that's fine as well. But yeah, just sort of the kind of what better explains it overall.
Sure.
And why we have the moral systems that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I dropped not exactly a bombshell, but a little bit before we got started, I was like, I might be an anti-realist today. And if people don't know what that is, a moral realist is somebody who believes that there is in sort of the broad terms, an objective moral standard of morality. Some things, there's just moral facts in the world, and some things are just right or wrong.
Okay.
And a moral anti-realist is someone who says, well, no, that is not the case. But it gets a lot more complicated from there. So to get started off, first of all, Jaylen, Dylan, how you guys doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
welcome.
Thanks for having us back. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
Hey, just as a heads up, I'm getting
Yes.
like a feedback loop. Like I keep hearing what you said 20 seconds ago.
Oh,
I don't know if that's something on your end or if there's something we could fix.
That's not fantastic. I'm not getting a feedback. You've got headphones in. I don't know why that's happening.
I'm not getting any feedback either.
So it sounds like I think Jaylen had a little bit of trouble, technical issues last time, and it looks like Dylan. Looks like you're up.
Now it's my turn.
You were going to complain about your string lights, but now you can complain about your.
That's
your
right.
audio.
That's right.
That's too funny.
Now it's my turn.
You were going to complain. Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, I just unplugged it for a second. So
okay, but can you still hear me now?
I can hear you, but it's the same volume as what you said 20 seconds ago. So it sounds like a tornado of cacophony in my headphones.
I'm not
really sure what I can do to mitigate that.
Well, we're not off to a great start. Is it okay if I try to push through while you work on it?
Do you have any suggestions on how I could
to fix that?
I could try re-entering the chat. I don't know if that would help.
Yeah, maybe drop out and come back in.
Use the same link?
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
okay.
The same link will be fine.
All right, I'll do that right now. Sorry about that, guys.
That's okay. It's okay.
It's like we're cursed or something, man.
Yeah, I know. It keeps coming after us.
Yeah.
Normally these things run okay, but you never know. And it's weird because he joined the call beforehand and there was kind of no issue.
Yeah, everything was fine.
Yeah. And dogs are losing it, which is why I need a soundproof office.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting, while all this is crumbling around us, what's new with you?
No, nothing much is new with me, man. We actually, I guess as a shameless plug, we're actually gearing up to start recording our own content. That'll be coming next month.
Yeah, I saw you had a link to you guys just started your YouTube channel, or you've had it for a while. I just saw it promoted. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. We've had it for a little while now, but actually we're gonna start uploading content. Oh, there Dylan is. But we're gonna start recording and uploading content here next month. So for those who are interested in supporting us, feel free to look out for that.
Cool. Very good, Dylan, sir.
I'm back and no more cacophony.
That is fantastic. Sometimes it could be a device pairing thing and just kind of refreshing.
I think it's because I have a MacBook. I had Safari and Google Chrome open.
Oh,
and
yeah, that
was
done
the
it.
Source. So
gotcha.
Should be good now.
It's a learning process, man. I learned how to do podcasting by making lots and lots and lots of errors.
Experience is a good teacher.
And it's just part of it. The beautiful thing about this is when I go to edit this, basically this whole section won't exist.
Perfect.
on the
I'll
get rid of it. So yeah. Let's get back to it, guys. So discussing of morality for me and again, I don't think it's an on atheism explanation, but because atheism is really just the belief that there are no gods. That doesn't explain anything else. It doesn't explain morality. It doesn't explain value. It doesn't explain. It doesn't explain anything. It's just one position regarding one proposition, right? Oh yeah, and there's my other co-host Molly. What regards to naturalism, which I think is a better explanation, and again, naturalism is really just the belief that the natural world, kind of exhausts everything in existence. That in terms of causal relationships, you're not going to find a non sort of physical causation towards anything else, which is again excluding something like the divine, right?
Sure.
Because I think that's a better explanation for reality. You guys obviously disagree. We're not here to discuss that per se, but on naturalism, I think we have an accounting for morality that comes via, our understanding of morality and variety of moral systems. Hang on a second. Yeah, 2 dogs in here doesn't work. We're going to keep trying. That evolutionary processes are providing accounting for this because pro-social behavior, working together in a group for survival, common interests, meeting common goals. That should be okay. Common interests and common goals will help sort of explain where these things come from. We see this in the animal kingdom. Other species of animals, especially other mammals, have social orders. They have not exactly rules in the rigid sense that we would discuss, but there are expectations within group behavior, and you see this a lot in other primates, especially. And so, to me, we've just evolved to, I guess, be a lot more complicated based on this same sort of premise, that because we have more developed brains than other animals and better ability to recognize each other's faces, social affect, things like that, so that we could understand what, say, another organism is experiencing. And this allows us to identify effectively moral patients and whether or not they're moral agents. In the same way we can have, empathy for other animals that aren't humans, right? There's not just a pro-human like speciesist thing that like we find animals adorable, right? Because we are looking at the emotional state of another creature that's able to experience, say, harm, for example, that it can be in pain, it can be suffering. We can see this and recognize this. We understand this kind of thing. And we've evolved in a way to value mitigating sort of suffering, harm to promote flourishing. And to me, that's where morality comes from. And I'm sorry if I kind of like stuttered and chopped through that a little bit. There's a lot going on in this house right now. So but that's sort of the basic bare bones of it. If you kind of want to give your take on it, then we can have a little bit of a back and forth. That may be a good place to proceed.
Sure. You want me to kick us off, Dylan?
Yeah, go for it, my guy.
Sure. So for us, morality is simply it's a system or a conformity to rules of conduct or rules of right conduct. Now in the theist worldview, or if you want to get more specific, in the Christian worldview, our morality is derived from the character of God. And not just the character of God, but the fact that God intentionally went about the purposes of creating us for a purpose, and giving us intrinsic value. And based on that purpose that he created us for and the intrinsic value that he gave us, here's how we are to conduct ourselves because of that. Mm-hmm. And then also, actually, I'll just leave it there. Dylan, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that sums it up pretty straightforward. Yeah. So
okay. So see if I understand this correctly. This is essentially because you've been imbued with a certain like intrinsic value, mm-hmm. that there is a certain conduct that is required to respect that value in others. Is that kind of
that along with there being a purpose to life.
Mm-hmm.
that God has created us for, and since we were created for a particular purpose, here is how we are to conduct ourselves based on that purpose.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay. I guess I'm not necessarily. So let me back up just a second, because
Sure.
the reason atheists and theists end up debating about morality all the time is because these conversations get weaponized. We make these arguments and take these philosophical positions as a way of attacking the other.
Yeah.
Oh, if you don't believe in God, then it's all just whatever, and it doesn't matter. And a lot of this comes down to criticizing naturalists as basically all moral relativists or subjectivists, which tends to take us this very pejorative kind of a bent to it, right?
Sure.
And it becomes this game of, let's see who can make who bite the bullet on certain, moral hypotheticals, like, is it always wrong to torture a baby just for fun? Like these kinds of things. And who could dare object to that without sounding like a monster, right? So these are the kind of games that we're playing. So, each of our positions can have an accounting for where morality came from or its sort of intended purpose. And if I just became a moral anti-realist, this becomes now the game of, are you guys going to want to make me bite some particular bullet, right? Because I think just giving an accounting for either by itself is like, yes, we have an explanation on one or explanation on another, but like, can we suss out like of what value this accounting is, right? Because it's not going to have any real impact on the way we live our lives. So to me, it's more important to get to kind of that heart of what are we going to do with this? Like what is actually, the ontology of it, right? What is actually really true about morals and values and things like that. And we discussed last time, we talked about purpose, and meaning in life and things like that. And you guys hold the position that it's intrinsic. And I think that that's not kind of based on the definition of how things are valued and whether or not something is prescribed a purpose, whether or not that can be objective, as in just true. And I heard this great explanation for calling something, let me see here. It's stance independent. If something is stance independent, like we discussed last time, if a rock exists on the ground somewhere, it is stance independent. It is just a feature of reality. Here's a rock on the ground. And it doesn't matter. You can be right or wrong about it. This is just a feature of reality. Now, where we come into this conundrum, and where all these battles take place, is talking about whether or not, first of all, God himself is stance independent. I would reject that thoroughly. That I would say to believe, and even if this is a moral system that you absolutely agree with and you believe is true and right, and you want to live your life according to it, I think that's still an anti-realist position, because it's not stance independent. It is based on, if you want to say, God's will, nature, character, his views on reality, the purpose he's given. Those are all based on his stance. They're not just true in reality, because if they were, they would be whether or not God exists. And
So
that's sort of the crux.
And I just want to clarify a couple of things before we move forward. So when you say an anti-realist position,
yes,
do you mean there are no objectively good or bad moves for morality? Is that basically the stance that you're saying? And so someone could be a theist is also an anti-realist because he's using a subjective source. Is that sort of the stance you're taking?
Right. That it's not a stance independent position. To say that moral realism is true means that there are moral facts that are stance independent. So, because people get wrapped around the axle, whether they call it mind independent or opinion independent and things like that, because then people start to argue, well, God's not like us. He doesn't have opinions like we do, and so on and so forth. But he still has a stance. There's still things that fit with his standards and things that don't.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that I'm leaning in favor of saying, if God exists, that he would have to be an anti-realist, or following his standard of morality would be an anti-realist. I'm not discounting necessarily that, say, moral realism is true. I just don't think it lends anything to, say, a theistic position, because it would have to be true whether or not God exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't be stance independent.
Well, I do have some pushback on that idea.
Please do.
And the reason I have some is because when we talk about morality, we're talking, in order for there to be any logical foundation to it, it has to start with the mind. And so this idea that morality, in order for it to be objective, it has to be stance independent. I'm not quite sure how that applies to the conversation, to the context of morality, just due to the fact that it has to start with a mind, whether it be God's mind or our mind, or there's a mind involved somewhere. Because, or if there's no mind involved, then we're just saying that morality is a byproduct of chemical reactions in my brain. In which case, why would anybody trust the morality that they've come up with? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. My girlfriend was saying.
Hi.
Hello.
So I am not as invested in the religious aspect of this conversation. I really wanted to listen in, mostly because of, like David mentioned, my interest in sociology and psychology.
Sure.
And so that's where my background is. And just as I'm listening, I wanted to kind of interject and clarify a little bit here that when we're talking about morality, to say God's morality is, and for lack of a better way to say it, it's an incorrect way to address it, because morality is concerned with right or wrong, but it's defined by a cultural or religious value, not or a standard, not a value. So it can't be any one person's. It's a collective. So it would be more accurate to say Christian morality rather than God's morality, because there's tons of gods that we could go with.
Sure.
So if we're, and I know that might just seem kind of nuanced in my pointing it out, I just want to make sure that the conversation isn't stuck on the idea that God handed down this definition of what morals Christian or Christ followers should have. It's a socialized kind of concept. It's developed.
Yeah. So I guess the issue here, and Dylan, you can chime in here. I guess the issue then with this is, for the theist or for the follower of Christ in particular, what you said didn't happen actually did. That our conduct and our conformity to right conduct is based on the fact that Christ did hand down, here's how to live, or God, and then Christ came in personified. This is how we are to conduct ourselves, and you are to conduct yourself this way because you are created by me for a purpose.
How would you, using that,
and regardless of what the culture has to say about it, this is what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no intention on debating your belief system.
Sure. No, it's fine. I just wanted to clarify that.
The question I have is, let's suppose that I understand that, I believe that, go forward with it. How do you explain or what do you think about the different caveats of Christianity and different belief systems who are all Christ followers, but their beliefs...
Are you referring to denominations?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
But they are all different in one way or another. There is some moral difference or some value difference in between each denomination.
Sure.
But if they're all Christ followers and Christ is handing down this definition of what morality looks like, how do you work that out? How does that get explained?
Sure.
So I guess the primary difference between denominations is not about moral value judgments by any means, but it's about how a church service is conducted. How does liturgy go? How does the authority in the church work? How do we do communion? All of these sort of secondary doctrinal issues. There's not really a lot of moral issues in terms of like a Catholic church compared to a Protestant church, and within the Protestant denominations like Presbyterian or Baptist or whatever. The basic concepts are all pretty much the same from a moral standpoint and from a teaching standpoint and being followers of Christ. Now, that being said, we could take that to another stance and say, well, there's been people in the past who claim to be Christian and did this sort of thing. And so I would also argue that there's a lot of people that claim to be Christian that aren't really following the teachings of Christ. And so typically what a Christian, how I would at least define it, is someone who has put their faith in Christ and is actively living out the teachings of Christ. So we could talk about the different ways a church service is oriented, when we get baptized or when we take and how we take communion, but those are the primary differences amongst denominations. It's not like one Christian church is doing this moral thing and this Christian church is doing that moral thing. It's mainly doctrinal issues.
That's actually inaccurate. And I'm sorry. I actually work for a Christian publishing company. So I am well educated on denominational differences. That is just a part of my everyday life.
Sure. So what moral issues are different between different denominations?
We'll talk about, for example, we could talk about the way women are treated differently in different denominations. Okay. There is a bit of morality and value in that, and how that is handed down through Christ, like in the Bible, that is interpreted differently, and therefore that plays out in their real everyday life differently. Sure. So their moral standards in that denomination are different than the moral standards in another denomination. That is how morality works in the church system, how it's played out in real everyday life. And so my question is, if morality is handed down by God, only one God in the Christian God spectrum of all the denominations, how do we talk about the different denominations and how that plays out in everyday life? And are you saying that one is wrong and the others are right or not right?
Sure. So when we talk about that particularly amongst the denominations of Christianity, what we have to first do is set what is the standard. We have to answer that question first. What is the standard? And for the follower of Christ, what the standard is supposed to be is Christ, the way Christ lived his life and what he taught. And that's supposed to be the metric by which we conduct ourselves and in our individual lives, as well as in church services, as well as how we do things with each other and our relationships with each other. And so when we look at these different denominations and how they do things, or any moral conflicts or issues that may arise, what's supposed to be the standard is Christ. And everything, the buck starts and stops there. And so as it relates to different interpretations and things like that, there are some things that can be interpreted a little differently. But for the most part, as it relates to morality, I think Christ is rather clear with how he lived his life and what he taught, as it relates to most moral issues. Even things with women in the church and things like that. I think it's rather clear, and I think over time and studying scripture, I would love to think that we've been able to move past that, but apparently not. But some of the misinterpretations of scripture and stuff like that took place in the past in terms of how we used to conduct ourselves. A lot of that had to do with a misunderstanding of what the standard is. And for us, it's supposed to be Christ.
Okay. So for my edification, from your viewpoint, if we were to take, I'm using the concept of women because I'm a woman. So if we were to take, I was raised in a Pentecostal church. Okay. So if we were to take Pentecostal denomination, and we can compare it to Church of Christ and how women exist within those denominations versus, say, Southern Baptist. So from a strictly Pentecostal viewpoint, we would say that women must wear a skirt and they must not wear makeup. And if they do, that would be immoral. In Church of Christ, women have to cover their head when they pray, and they are subservient to the man. And if they're not, that would be immoral. None of that is true in Southern Baptist.
And wearing the color red is of the devil, and all of these silly things that just aren't biblical. And it's really funny because in our church, we had a Bible study about 6 months ago pointing out all these flaws and how none of them have any scriptural basis whatsoever. So I would, at the very least, say they are not being biblically sound from that perspective. And in some sense, they're being slightly derogatory towards women. So I would say, from a scriptural standpoint, they have no basis. They have no basis to make those claims. It's more of like a social construct that they could say and what they think it should be. There's no biblical basis for saying you shouldn't wear red in the church if you're a woman. You have to wear a certain length skirt or something like that. So yeah, there's no scriptural basis for stuff like that. And I'm sorry that you had a negative influence like that at a young age.
Yeah.
Is that consistent with what you think as well, Jaylen? That
you know, there. I mean, Dylan, are you guys okay?
Dogs are going nuts. Sorry. Keep going. We're listening.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think Dylan kind of hit it on the head there. That there's theology, the study of God, and then there's a little bit of meology mixed in there. And sometimes sometimes in church, in certain denominations and things like that, you'll see the two get mixed up and things get really muddy in terms of what's actually biblically based and what's just personal preference. There is room for some of that in church. There is room for some personal preference in there a little bit in terms of, you know, maybe you want to sing 4 songs instead of 5. Maybe you want to do a meet and greet first and then sing, or you want to do sing first and then do meet and greet.
Right.
You know, that there's some of that in there, but some of the things that we've really hung our hat on in church from a moral standpoint, I think that we are noticing the speck in our neighbor's eye, but without removing the plank from our own in some of these areas.
Absolutely.
And so that's, you know, I'm in step with Dylan on that.
Okay. Thanks.
I think maybe if this helps kind of everybody at all, it's not to say necessarily because there is broad disagreement on certain topics, whether or not it's small doctrinal things like, you know, cover your head or don't cover your head. Or, you know, the order that a service should take place in, or whether or not you should have music. Because I've seen a split within a Church of Christ over whether or not to have instrumental music.
Yeah.
And it is a real thing that
That's
like they
that's
split
insane.
off, they started their own church somewhere else because somebody wanted like a pipe organ. Like,
David, and I got to be honest with you, that you see a lot of that.
Yeah.
That's stone cold truth.
Yeah.
You see a lot of that. It's silly.
Yeah. And it's, well, I mean, and you've probably heard, you know, what's his name? Matt Dillon. He was a popular, you know, atheist debater talking about, you know, no one can tell you as much about how wrong, you know, the First Baptist Church is as you just go down the street to the Second Baptist Church. They'll tell you how terrible they are. And so religious disagreement doesn't mean that it's all wrong or that there wasn't necessarily one correct original source. I'm happy to grant that. It's just the amount of religious confusion over, you know, non-trivial moral issues, you know, pipe organ doesn't really rate to me, but like, you know, same-sex marriage, we're talking, you know, sexual ethics in general, you know, the treatment of women, like there is just abortion, which, man, like again, I'm just gonna put a pin in that. We're gonna keep moving, because we could get into all kinds of stuff,
right.
But just a variety of issues, you know, and you see a lot of this, you know, like cultural Christianity, particularly strongly associated with the Republican Party and things like that, that you see this combination, you go, this cannot be anything like, and I have friends who are, you know, very liberal Christians, and they, you know, they bemoan how, you know, these kinds of teachings really have nothing to do with Christ whatsoever. You know, where people on the other side, and I think this is what she was getting at, is that people on the other side were saying, no, we're the ones who got it right. What you're saying has nothing to do with the teachings of Christ, and the fact that no one could ever seem to agree. And again, that doesn't mean there isn't a correct original source or original standard or values that have been proposed, and they're just not being followed. Like that's, you know, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But I guess to move, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm just answering my question.
Yeah. And she's smart. She's genius. Anyway, she should do this instead of me. So, okay. To move forward from that. So the idea is, to me, with regards to kind of come back to the realism versus anti-realism thing, you know, and we can even kind of invoke this, that people have different values, different standards, even within Christianity. The fact that you cannot get someone who doesn't have certain values. It's really the only thing you can do is get them to change their values,
Sure.
to get them to sort of agree with you. That we can all jump in on certain things that are, say, normative ethics, like, you know, torturing a baby just for fun is wrong. Like, you don't have to be a moral realist to believe that. Like, you really don't at all. And I know that's like one of the most common kinds of arguments, is that we can all agree that normatively that we all have a value system that says, you know, causing harm gratuitously is wrong. That doesn't necessarily make it objectively true, but that's just our values, that we don't like to see that in others just because we don't. Like, there may be nothing really deeper that grounds it, you know. And this becomes a question of, you know, we're biting these bullets essentially, like to be an anti-realist. And again, and not that I would defend anybody, but it's because of the fact that if you encountered somebody said, I love torturing babies just for fun, it brings me happiness and joy in my life, there is, other than arguing with them to get them to change that value, there is nothing I can say or do to this person to get them to want to stop, right? I have to convince them through argumentation to change their values, because that behavior is motivated through their values, or a spouse, you know, desire to engage in that kind of behavior is based on their values, their goals. I can't just say, well, you're just wrong, because they won't care.
So I think the big thing I'm pointing out here, unless someone is psychologically not in the right mind, for lack of better terms, I have not met anyone who looked at another human being as a human being and did enjoy torturing babies for fun. There are these things you can look back in history where, like, these general things like stealing is bad. It is a bad thing that people don't like. That killing is wrong, and all these sort of things. I mean, and the big thing is, if we have this value judgment on humans, that's what makes it wrong. And so I think from an anti-realist perspective, if we're going back to the core question of what better explains morality, atheism or theism, I don't really see how an atheistic anti-realist perspective can better explain these moralities that we have. Because if at the end of the day, if you're just saying it's an opinion that I have, it's a preference that I have to not torture babies, yet I think it's kind of weird that just about every single human in their right mind also has that opinion. Same thing with stealing and all these other things. And so we can talk about how we've come to know those things from sociological sort of conditioning or parental conditioning. But the point is that theism is providing a foundation for where those come from, not how we have come to know those things. Okay. So it's like a source, not so much how we came to know of these sort of guidelines or protocols of the source, if that makes sense.
Sure. It sounds like what you're saying is that theism is like the root, and we might have socialized it all the way down through history, through family systems,
Sure.
and cultural differences along the way. But way back when, it had to start somewhere, and the start came from theism. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it even says so in scripture, where it says that what was right and wrong was written on their hearts. It was something that we know deep down. Like, I know deep down that if I steal from someone, it is objectively wrong. I shouldn't do that. Same thing with killing another human being and all these other things. Now, people in the past have done things like that and overridden that. Typically, if we look at killing, for example, they are overriding that by devaluing or dehumanizing the person. I mean, even in tribes, I can't think of the correct term for it, forgive me, but in like third world country tribes that perform cannibalism, they don't perform cannibalism on people in their specific tribe unless they outcast them and devalue and dehumanize them. So they still eat people, but they have put them mentally in a spot where that person isn't a person. It was the same thing with the Holocaust, where, it's not people, these are Jews, and Jews are bad, and we want to propitiate human flourishing and create a better race. And so these sort of objective standards that we do have as a society were overridden by devaluing the subject, or the victim, we could even say, by saying they're not human or human enough, like in Hitler's case.
Yeah. I don't necessarily disagree with that take on it, especially in regards to like tribalism, outgroup hostility, things like that. Like even look at the Old Testament, the in Levitical law and stuff, that the rules that the Hebrews had for themselves were not the same for the rules they had for everybody else. Slavery being a rather obvious example of that. When a Hebrew could sell themselves into indentured servitude, but that had an expiration on it unless they elected to kind of continue in that, versus people taken as slaves from basically other tribes or other nations. Like those were property passed on as inheritance, so on and so forth. And this isn't to get into like an argument about that, but it's just another example that comes to mind of this kind of out-group hostility. They're not like us, or these other things. It's okay to do to them things that we would never do to ourselves, because we view ourselves as different or superior for one reason or another. To go back to like the torturing babies thing, and the fact that this is kind of ubiquitous across cultures, right? I mean, again, there are outliers and exceptions, right? There always are. And that's generally explicable to me that, in every society, it is beneficial to the continuance and flourishing of that society to not torture your babies, right? That doesn't end well, and doesn't help to, propagate, your tribe essentially, in whatever society you came from. So that would be true of all tribes. So it's a universe, even as a thing that's universally agreed upon, that doesn't make it a stance independent moral fact. In my view, is what I'm saying. And where this becomes more obvious to me, this kind of difference, is when places where we don't agree, like injunctions against homosexuality, for example. That is, if that's an objective moral fact, that should be written on all of our hearts. And it's only, the weird aberrant ones that don't agree with it. And yet there is extremely broad disagreement, but obviously within our own culture. But in different cultures,
I want to stick with the first analogy that you gave about killing babies and everything. And you say the main reason why we don't do that is the propitiation of the human race. Why is propitiation of the human race a good thing?
If you look in the environment, it's not necessarily, in terms of like the health of the planet. What's our value system? I want my family to be okay. I want my neighbors to be okay. I am a member of this group. I want to be accepted by them. And we have this, kind of symbiotic relationship with other people where we help each other. We thrive on cooperation. That's how our species are. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing, because to say that it's just a good thing because we're doing it, like it kind of becomes a naturalistic fallacy. Like, this is how we're wired, so therefore it's good and right. No, this is our value system. And that's why we're acting on it. We all have, with very few exceptions, a value system that incorporates the idea that you should not torture babies just for fun. That does not make it stance independent. It means everyone that we talk to that has a stance is going to agree on this one thing at least.
Right. But my question is more so, like, I understand you're doing it because you want to be accepted by society, and society thriving is a good thing. And the good thing seems like a moral judgment. And I just want to know, why is the propitiation of society a good thing on an anti-realist perspective?
Well, that's what I'm saying. If it's my value system, right, or any anti-realist value within their value system, that is a good thing, or something that is a goal or a desire of theirs.
Would you say that's your opinion, or that's objectively true, that it's a good thing?
No, I would say it's a matter of opinion. So someone could have an anti-realist position that the flourishing of society is terrible. And and they could have arguments for that. They could have reasons. Say like I said,
would they be wrong for taking out society? Is my question. That's what I'm trying to kind of get at. Because
not to them.
Well,
I guess where it sounds like Dylan's going with this.
I feel it.
Is how do you hold someone accountable for their behavior in this application? So let's say, like you just said, it is beneficial for human flourishing that we don't torture babies, or we don't harm babies, don't kill babies, right? Okay, cool. Somebody else comes along and says, I think it's better for human flourishing that we don't kill certain babies. There are ones that we do, and there are other ones that we don't. If it's just a matter of opinion that this guy is right or wrong, how do you hold him accountable for the torture or the killing of certain babies? if it's all just a matter of opinion. Because I mean, if we were to take this to court and you were to say, hey, in my opinion, you should have done this, and he were to say, well, what makes your opinion better than mine? My opinion, we should have.
I mean, it ultimately comes down to a power struggle, right? If we were part of a society that valued, the torture of certain babies and not others, if I was a person who came in and said we shouldn't torture any babies, and I found myself in trouble for that, what argument could I possibly make to a society that says, no, this is terrible and wrong? You're supposed to torture these babies, these certain babies, and not other ones, or whatever the case may be. We're using obviously the most hyperbolic kind of example possible, but I mean, there are more realistic applications to this. Again, regarding sexual ethics, like homosexuality. Is it outlawed? Well, what if you see someone who's homosexual and you're like, well, no, I'm not going to turn them in because I don't see anything wrong with what they're doing. I could still be punished by society. Or if, say in the case of abortion, just to put a pin on it and not really dive into that, because that's a whole other day, basically, of talking and saying, that I'm supposed to be morally obligated and legally obligated to see if someone's, performing an abortion, then I'm supposed to turn them in. Well, what if I don't agree with that? Well, the whole of society is telling me, the majority of society is telling me that I'm wrong and immoral for that. And I don't really care, because I disagree with that. It really just comes down to what kind of power dynamic we're living under.
Sure.
And that could be, and I understand where this is going. That could lead to some really terrible consequences within sort of these hypothetical scenarios. Sure,
it can, and not just hypothetically.
I think we're living in it right now, personally. But go ahead.
Sure, and not even just hypothetically though. I mean, you have real life examples. In the Nuremberg trials of 1945, where the Nazi lawyers, when they came to give a defense for the Nazi guards who were on trial for the crimes that they committed during the Holocaust, their defense was, who are we as an American culture to hold these guys accountable for what they did in Nazi Germany when they were just simply following orders and following what was acceptable in their culture. And it was a brilliant move because the Nuremberg trials actually stopped for a period of time because of it. But then you had American counsel, I think his name was Robert Jackson. Don't quote me on that. He comes in and he says, wait a second, hold on, guys, there is a law above the law of culture, above the law of the land. And that's what we appeal to when we say that these crimes were wrong and these were crimes against humanity, and they were objectively wrong, not just wrong here in Nazi Germany. It's wrong here in Nazi Germany. It's wrong in Paris. It's wrong in London. It's wrong in Chicago. It's wrong in Pennsylvania. This is wrong everywhere. And he was appealing to a standard beyond what was set in place by society and widely accepted. I mean, you've seen how 20 million Jews were killed. He appealed to a law that was above the law of the land, and that's what we mean when we talk about when we call it God's morality. That's what we mean when we say that. It is the moral absolutes that we all appeal to when we say you should not have done this, you should not have treated me this way, you ought not do this, you ought do that.
Yeah. So I guess my take on that is that the way I look at it is, and again, this is not to put words in anybody's mouth or tell you or to second guess you.
Sure, no problem.
Generally speaking, I think most people, if you ask them, view themselves, especially people who are like laypersons who don't engage in these kinds of debates, would probably think of themselves as moral realists if you put that vocabulary in their mouth. If you say some things are just right and some things are just wrong.
Sure.
Mostly this is based on deep-seated intuitions and cultural expectations, values and norms, things like that. And there's things that are irreducibly normative, things that we talk about, mitigating harm and suffering and things like that to promote human flourishing. But it still comes down to a shared value system that's based on that. And we can say that it's universal wherever you're doing that, even if your culture says it's okay. My value and belief system says that's definitely not okay. And even to the point where I would take action against a person who is acting in such a way because I would feel morally obligated to do so. It's still an anti-realist position. And the behavior is literally no different whatsoever. I'm just not appealing to a stance independent, standard for that. And Dylan, to kind of revisit briefly, would you say that that's my opinion with regards to certain values or morals or things like that I may have about certain behavior or actions? That it's an opinion, but I don't want to trivialize that by saying like, well, it's just an opinion. Well, there's reasons that motivate it, right?
Sure.
And that's based on underlying value system. And that value system is, again, with Christian, atheist, whoever, for most things, that's not really different, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are some things that we do have differences on, and they become, quite divisive, obviously, as we see in society today. But generally speaking, we're all operating off of the same impetuses because we have most of the same values on these things. And it's just whether or not it's logically possible to appeal to a standard that is stance independent is really what this all comes down to, because almost all of the behavior is the same otherwise.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I am one of those lay persons who doesn't engage in these kinds of conversations very often,
No worries.
mostly because they are incredibly sensitive and I never want to offend anyone. But I did want to just kind of interject a bit of science into this, because that's my little background here.
Sure.
So when we talk about what drives a person to be empathetic, to recognize another person's humanity, to, strive towards their own well-being and the well-being of those around them within their in-group. And some of that comes down to the chemicals in their brain. For example, we can influence a person's entactogens in their brain to make them more empathetic, to make them more aware of a sense of self-being or well-being, and to pursue closeness with others through medication. In fact, you can take psychedelics, and this is an intervention that I've been studying, the use of psychedelics in therapy to influence a person's lifelong post-treatment connection to their inherent interest in promoting the well-being of other people and their interest in preserving the planet. So if we look at genetic factors, there is some of that influencing whether or not a person can recognize morality and how they recognize it in combination with a value system compared to other people. It has, religion aside, that is a genetic component that influences a person's ability to see that. And rewind a little bit, I didn't want to interrupt, but you were talking about whether or not someone absolutely sees something as right or wrong, or if there's nuance. For example, you can kill some babies, but not all babies, which I think is a comical reference, but so that
it's, if you look throughout history, it's a thing.
Yeah. No, I believe you. I just think it's an attention getter, the killing of babies there. So that would be more like ethical absolutism versus, I wrote notes as you guys were talking. So if I'm looking down, it's because I wrote notes.
Sure, no problem.
So ethical absolutism would be like, there's one true, valid moral code that applies to everyone in all places at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Or ethical relativism, which is right and wrong, but not absolute. It depends on the person's circumstance or social situation.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about those kinds of dichotomies, you have to talk about, whether or not a person is acting because of their fear of consequence, or, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you referred to, also notes. You referred to a bit of your morality as an intrinsic value.
The morality is based on the intrinsic value that we've been given by.
Got it. Okay. So my thought on that, and forgive me if some of this seems like I'm pulling apart words. I'm not trying to, but it's not exactly intrinsic if a person is motivated for their behavior or their moral guide is based on a potential consequence for not following that guide. Intrinsic means it came from within. It's natural. I was born with it.
The value is intrinsic. The morality has some intrinsic properties to it, but ultimately, what makes it objective is the fact that it's given to us by an eternal God, who created us for a purpose. That's what I mean by it. The value is intrinsic.
And to bounce off of that, I feel this sort of like the consequential concept, or if I don't do this, I'm going to go to hell. That's kind of where I see that going. That's not necessarily how salvation in Christendom works. And so salvation is achieved by placing your faith in Christ. It's not if I donate to this many charities and work this much and work my way. That is not how it works. A great quote that we could use is, I don't work to earn my salvation. I do good works because I am saved. I am in great gratitude because of the gift that God has given us. And so I don't go around really scared, like, oh no, if I don't make enough picnic baskets today, God's going to send me to hell or anything like that. I don't do the things I do because I'm afraid that God's going to send me to hell. Right. I do it out of an immense amount of gratitude and the amount of respect I have for other human beings, because I know they have intrinsic value. They have a general, extreme amount of worth, and I value them. Yeah.
Yeah, so now there are some worldviews. I'm sorry but there are some worldviews that believe actually that's actually one of the things that makes Christianity different from other worldviews is the fact that what you were just talking about, Janie, with kind of earning my way and there being a consequence if I don't. That's actually one of the big separators between Christianity and, say, Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, for that matter. In that in Christianity, you cannot earn your way to heaven.
So what would be your opinion on if you drove down the street? I don't know where you guys are, but in Tennessee, you can easily drive down the street and see billboards from Southern Baptist churches talking about if you're homosexual, then you're going to hell. Big picture of, characterized hell. And this is where you're going if you don't repent. So that is a threat of consequence for not following this biblical value system or sense of morality. Would you say that those people are not acting in a basis of theology or not biblically accurate, or what would be your viewpoint on that?
Sure. So the Bible makes it abundantly clear that homosexuality is a sin. The homosexual lifestyle is a sin. Now, it also makes it abundantly clear that Christ came and died on the cross for our sins so that we can be in right relationship with him. And one of the promises that he made while he was here was that for those of us who put our faith in him, when we die, we would join him in eternity and join him in heaven and spend eternity with him. Now, you're trying to give me the answer to the question, are all gay people going to heaven? I'm not answering that. And the reason why I'm not answering that is because I don't know, ultimately. But what I do know is that putting your faith in Christ gets you access to heaven. And choosing not to put your faith in Christ, God will honor your free choice. And ultimately, you will live separated from him if that's what you want eternity. And for those who want to live in relationship with him in eternity, they will.
And I think another thing that I think is imperative with this concept, I don't have to get clean, i.e. live perfectly. And I'm not even talking about this certain sexuality, just about any sort of, we could just say morally bad behavior or whatever we want to call it, right? I don't have to get clean to come to Christ. There's actually a parable in the Bible where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And Peter goes, oh no, like you're the great Rabboni, you're a teacher. Like, I'm not going to have you wash my feet. And he said, you have no part in my kingdom unless you let me wash your feet. And so when I first came to Christ, I mean, for example, I used to have problems with drugs and stuff like that. And if you were to tell me right away, you have to give up this if you're going to be a Christian, it would have been really hard and it would have put it off. It would have probably spent me down a different path. And this sort of non-obligatory thing to follow Christ and to learn about his teachings really was, for one, a relief off my back. And as I started to study and grow in relationship, a lot of these sort of things that seemed impossible in the past started to literally wash away. And for example, the drug addiction I had is no more. I am about almost 10 months clean so far.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congrats.
And I was enslaved, we could say, for 10 years. And so
I have struggled with drug addiction. I know that feeling. So
yeah,
I am proud of you.
Insurmountable. And I have tried groups. I have tried all of these sort of things, medication, you name it. I was trying it, and it never worked. And it was learning about the love of Christ and his teachings and the way he washed away my spirit that even made me want to change. It made me look at myself and make me want to change. So I think the big thing is you do not have to become clean to get saved. You got your foot in the door. That's great. Let's talk about getting clean now is more, I think, a more healthy way and biblically sound way of looking at it. And I think a lot of people, especially some Christians, that up. And it's very unfortunate because it gives this sort of obligatory, do this, then you get this sort of thing. Because the thing is, if I had to not sin in order to get into heaven, no one would make it.
We're done for.
I screw up every day.
Done
I ask
for.
for forgiveness every day because I'm not perfect and I fall short every day. And I am grateful for God's mercy and his love. So
and to piggyback off of that, Dylan, to kind of go back to the homosexuality thing, there's a difference between having a appetite for a sin and living in a sin. And I know people personally who have an appetite for homosexuality, but because of what Christ has done for their lives, much like what he's done for Dylan, they recognize that, hey, I can't live the lifestyle that I have an appetite for. And so their prayer is God, is God give me the strength to refrain from this temptation to live this way, because I recognize that living this way doesn't honor you.
Jaylen, I would really love to have a whole nother conversation with you about that very thing. Right there. Just another time, just that.
Sure.
Yeah, we could definitely go down a rabbit trail on that. That again, that's another, just like abortion, it's like a whole other thing. We have lots of LGBT friends, like, so it's very,
I work on LGBT movies, so and I'm with you.
What'd you say? You're in a movie?
I'm a film. I write music for films and TVs. I mean, I did like an LGBT movie a few years back, and I've done a few of them. So, like, I mean, I got friends that are in the community. I don't say like, oh, you're not this. You can't be my friend. Like
that seems like that would be very much against all the things you just said.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And once again, there's the standard.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So I guess if we can kind of bring this back into sort of the meta discussion. So from this standpoint, say again, my values have to do with harm, human flourishing, living, what the Epicureans and Stoics would call the good life, right? What are the things that are going to get us there? Not necessarily like a purely self-serving way, because like I can't be happy if I know everyone else around me is suffering, right? Because that's also part of my value system. So it's not like this shrewd, self-interested kind of way. It can a lot of times be characterized that way. So, but there's no part of my moral intuitions that tell me that two men that want to have sex with each other, that there's something wrong about that. If no one is harming anybody in the process, and it's consensual, and that it's not risky sexual behavior, things like that. That is my value system, right? And someone telling me, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds on whether or not you agree or disagree with that, but like my value system says this, and if there's one that's different, that just doesn't mean anything to me. That you say, well, I think unless I can be given a reason to change my value system about that behavior, I'm just not going to, no matter who else tells me it's wrong or what their value system says, and this and that. And this is a more significant kind of difference, rather than like the torturing babies just for fun thing. Like because this is real. People have real, obvious, and strong differences over this. That is not a cross-cultural thing that we all agree on, except for a few sociopaths, right? That we, we have a very strong difference in value systems. And there's really nothing you can say to somebody who has a different value system. Like I could not convince you because you live in, I guess, a form of natural theology where the human body is for a certain purpose and reproduction and things like that and glorifying God. And mine, that's not a thing at all. So,
Sure.
The way I'm looking at this is like, well, is anybody being harmed by this behavior? Are they happy? Are they, is this a maladaptive behavior? Are they engaged otherwise as normal, healthy adults that are functioning well in society? If all those other things are
I hate
true.
to interrupt you, but are you using harm as the standard for morality?
I think it's one of the elements that pretty much always comes under consideration.
I guess that's the problem.
That's not the only thing, but it's there.
I guess that's the problem I have interpreting your opinion. And I know you are a new convert to anti-realism.
Sure.
So I'm trying to give you lots of bonus points. But on one hand, you're talking about
I have so many atheist friends who are philosophers that will one rejoice and then on the other side will be really annoyed with me.
Right. No, I'm with you.
Anyway, go ahead.
On one hand, you're talking about how anti-realism, there isn't really an inherent sense of right and wrong. But on the other hand, you're talking about how there are standards you can use, like harm, to figure out what is right or wrong. Would you say are you defining what's right and wrong as human propitiation? And this is what I was trying to get at earlier.
I guess,
and I guess I'm trying to understand.
I'm trying to use these as sort of like synonymous that like,
I get what you mean. Like
we're
the
being
human
beneficent
species
to, moral, and not just humans, but moral patients around us, right? If you can experience suffering, harm, like a dog might be a moral patient, right? It's not a moral agent. You can't expect a dog to, to act with a certain sense of moral obligation in a scenario, but it can be something that you can do wrong by doing wrong too.
Sure.
Like if I cause my dog, I'm tempted with all her barking, to strangle her, right? Like she can experience suffering. And if I'm doing this gratuitously, right, that I believe I'm doing something wrong based on my value system.
So David, quick question, because I'm listening to you talk and you talking about suffering and harm and things like that. Who defines suffering and harm?
Well, I think it's a biological state, right, and psychological state that experiencing anguish, and my friend Ben Watkins, who is a moral realist, that it comes down to him of saying pain is bad, right? That is like bedrock.
Why? What makes it? Like when you say pain is bad, who
right? Again, I'm not saying it again. I'm an anti-realist, but normatively, people who experience pain, this is a non-preferential state. This is a state of either mental or physical agony, of being harmed in some way.
Non-preferential is completely different than negative.
Yeah, it's the opposite of preferential.
But I guess what I'm just trying to figure out, like how does one go about in this anti-realist or naturalistic worldview? How does one go about identifying pain, and then how do I take what I've identified and categorize it as bad for me?
I think that's empirically determinable. You can hook someone up to, what is it called? The brain scan thing. You know what I'm talking about?
There's like a million.
Would you call it?
You mean
a CT scan? I mean, you can watch the neurological responses in someone as the synapses are firing. If you are causing somebody physical discomfort, or you're showing them things that are disturbing, like on a movie screen, like I don't know if you guys remember Clockwork Orange. That's kind of before all of our time technically, but his eyes were peeled open and he was given these horrifying images, while being given a drug that made him feel sick while he saw them. He was obviously suffering, and that is determinable in an empirical sense. Like that is a biological and psychological, which I guess is also biological, state of affairs. So you can see that in a person's neurology and their physical responses.
Okay. But if there is no mind prior to the human mind, essentially our minds are kind of a random, complex collection of chemical reactions, correct?
No. I would say, I mean, yes, there's complex chemical reactions. I wouldn't say it's random. It's a product of an evolutionary process.
Sure. But there's no mind behind it.
It's
There's
not mind driven,
life.
but minds exist. It's like to say, well, I'm just a bunch of chemicals in motion. I'm a bunch of chemicals that can get angry, happy. I can become sexually aroused. Like there's a variety of things that just chemicals can be doing. To describe it that way is like it's very reductive.
For sure, but there was no intelligent mind or design behind it. It kind of just happened on its own.
Yeah. It was not driven by any agency.
Okay, yes. It was not driven by any agency, so it was random.
No, those aren't the same thing. It's like me saying non-preferential is the same thing as like suffering, right? It's not random. It's because the rigors of surviving in reality. That's the third rail. Either the rock's on the ground or not. Like if someone bashes me in the head with a rock, I die, right? If it's hard enough, like that's just reality. The rigors of surviving have guided species to be better at surviving, and the ones that can do. That's the evolutionary process. It's resulted for good or ill in us.
Right, and I guess you could say it's not random, but it's definitely not guided or purposeful or anything like that. Other than
it's neither. Yeah.
Right. I think that's what Jaylen's kind of getting at.
Okay, yeah, and I just want to be careful with that because I feel like if I agree to it, then it's not the correct characterization of I guess what I'm trying to express.
But I guess ultimately what I'm getting at is if it is not guided, if there is no mind prior to the human mind, essentially all our mind is you can call it whatever you want to call it, but it is a collection of chemical reactions that kind of came together and formed this thing. But if that's truly the case, why should you trust your observation and perception about pain and bad and suffering?
Especially because you have evolved not to make moral value judgments necessarily. You have evolved to propitiate the species. You have evolved to best propagate your DNA. Right. You're not really in a position. And in fact, you're just kind of these thoughts that we think we're having are just chemical reactions in our brain. And we're just kind of following them based on how those other chemicals
sounds a little bit like that one argument from C.S. Lewis, and also was that Plantinga's like evolutionary argument against naturalism. Is that from either or both of those familiar to you guys?
Absolutely,
it is to me. But I was kind of just thinking about what even Charles Darwin said about the mind. If there's no mind prior to the human mind, is like like would you trust the thoughts of a monkey? Like. If that is true, that this is all kind of a random put together, series of chemical reactions that we just kind of got here with no guidance, no intelligence to it. Well, to say then that what I identify as bad and pain and things like that, it's not rooted in. And it's not rooted in anything to me. It's something that it seems like I can change if I want to.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
I think I see what you're saying.
My thoughts aren't grounded in anything.
Well, but I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is like that you can because we were through natural selection in evolution that we evolved to be good at surviving and passing on our genes. Like that is sort of the unguided goal of evolutionary processes, right?
Okay.
In order to be able to survive in this world long enough to reproduce, I have to have the ability to ascertain at least enough things correctly to continue, right? To survive long enough to reproduce, so on and so forth. Now, if my a priori sensory apparatus, my ability to sense and see and perceive the world around me is so bad that I am missing something crucial to my survival, I'm not going to survive. If I look over the end of a cliff and I don't see the end of a cliff and I keep going, guess what? I walk off the cliff, no more Dave, right? That is also natural selection. So nature could not select species that are so poor at ascertaining these things that they would not survive well enough to pass on their genes. Does it mean our senses are completely reliable? No. In fact, there are other species who have certain senses, like there are animals with better vision than us. There are animals with better hearing and smell. I'm looking at one of them right now. Than we do, right? We can be fooled. We fool ourselves all the time. We seek patterns in nature of things that aren't necessarily there. There's a word for it. I can't remember what it's called, but people who see like pictures in clouds and things like that, we're forming these things in our minds. They're not necessarily real, not necessarily there. But that's only possible insofar that it's buttressed by enough true beliefs and accurate sensory information that we're not bringing ourselves to our demise, essentially. It can only support so much falsehood before, if I see a tiger and I believe I'm running away from it when I'm actually running towards it, this is an example someone else has used, then like, that's not going to work out so well for me. There's a number of examples like this that you can throw in there, but like, could I think that I see, some rustling in some bushes and I believe it's a tiger erroneously and run away? Well, yes. But so insofar that's only going to work out so long as I'm not running towards a worse danger than the false danger that I perceived.
And again, that's the exact point that I'm basically making, where you aren't evolved and naturally selected to make coherent value judgments. It's just for evolution and propitiation of your species.
But I think one is a byproduct of the other because of the nature of our species being reliant, because we're not necessarily the physically strongest or the most hardy species out there in the animal kingdom, right? There's, apex predators that are way better than us, as individuals, right? But
right.
It's the fact that we work together in groups and that we can recognize the health and well-being in each other, and we have mirror neurons that can detect suffering, and we're dialed into empathy for this reason. The fact that we are evolved that way, that is a result of an evolutionary process.
Yeah. So to stick with the evolutionary concept a bit, I think I always mix up the two evolutionist names. So forgive me. I think Charles Dawkins, right?
No, that's Richard Dawkins.
Dawkins.
He's the British biologist who should stay off of Twitter. Yes.
Yeah, right. But in his book, The God Delusion, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, I actually read that one.
Yeah. Okay. So you'll be familiar with this concept. He talked about how if humans evolved in a more similar way to like honeybees, it would be socially acceptable and actually promoted and permitted for like parents to kill their children and all these other sort of things. So killing offspring or fertile mates and all of these sort of things. Or if we were to evolve in a similar way compared to any other animal, that sort of concept, like a grasshopper eating their mate after they copulate, those would become socially acceptable things. And so that doesn't really give us an objective standard.
I think there's a lot of women who would be on board with that right now. Just FYI. But
but the point I'm making is the evolutionary concept of getting to an objective morality of what is good and what is bad can't really be a foundation in evolution, because if we had a different twig in the cog or some kink in the works, we would have just had a different thing.
Yeah,
by the basis of naturalism, and therefore eating my child would just be a good thing and something I do on Tuesday nights.
Right. You would have under this hypothetical, you would have a vastly different value system, right? And yeah, I think your behavior would ensue from that accordingly. Which again, that's the anti-realist position, is that whatever our goals and values are, that's going to motivate. Something can only be a reason to motivate behavior, to say something's right or wrong, or to act in a certain way out of a moral obligation based on whatever our values are. Something has to be reason applying to the pre-existing value system that we already have, and the fact that it is possible within reality that we could have evolved to have a vastly different value system. There's really nothing I think anybody can say to that, honestly.
So the thing is, we could go in these hypotheticals. Let's use a more realistic and historical example, because we often are deriving our things from evolutionary concepts of morality or social concepts. With Hitler and the Nazis, with the devaluing of Jews, on the basis of naturalism and Darwinian evolution, he had very good reason to exterminate Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals. Sure. And so there's not really an objective from an anti-realist perspective.
There's not an objective.
Well, if you don't mind, I would love to
I'm
finish.
sorry,
my
I'll let you
point,
finish. I apologize.
From an anti-realist perspective, especially when he is deriving a lot of his starts from Darwinian theory. I mean, you could find quotes of Hitler talking about that. That's what he was inspired upon. He you can't really say that he was wrong, because not only did he use that to propagate the species to make an even better human race that would thrive better, but he even used Darwinian evolution as a basis for his moral compass and as a basis to propitiate human flourishing. And that's what you have defined on naturalism, or an anti-realist perspective on how we've gotten morality, as human flourishing. Now, it might be inconvenient, and from a short period of time, we could say, oh, well, it inflicted harm, so it's bad. But if we look at the grand scheme of things and taking out all of these negative religious systems and maybe deformities and stuff like that, in the long scheme of terms, it's going to maximize the possible good or happiness or flourishing in a human race in the totality of its lifespan, not just a simple 5 years. And so on a naturalistic basis, I don't really see how one could say that was bad or wrong other than a preference.
Well, again, it comes... There's a couple of things. One, you're familiar with like the is-ought distinction. You can't necessarily get an ought from an is. Like, so something like evolutionary theory or any scientific theory is giving an explanation of some natural phenomena, right? It doesn't tell you how you should feel about it. It's just saying, here is what happened. Here is this, we have this observed phenomenon. Here's a theory that we believe explains it better than anything else that we've come up with, right? That's how scientific theories are generally presented, and they can be, removed when a better theory comes about, if such a thing were to happen. Now, to take something like that and engage in like this kind of eugenics type argument, that's not the result of acknowledging evolution as real. Someone has added a value system to that, saying that what this person, again, say Hitler or the Germans, whatever, look at Jews as genetically inferior. First of all, that flies kind of directly in the face of what evolutionary theory actually proposes. It's
right,
not
but it was a
question
bouncing off of social Darwinism, is what Dawkins
right.
talked about.
But social Darwinism is not evolutionary theory, right? It is a sort of,
well, it's based off of Darwinian evolution.
It's sort of like a what's it? Sort of like if you take like a sophomoric understanding of it and you've turned this into a social theory, basically, but they're not exactly the same thing. So someone's derived a value system based on sort of a misapprehension of how evolutionary theory works to say, well, this is what we should do. And that is their value system, right? I think their value system is based on misinformation or just a poor understanding, maybe.
Would you say they were wrong?
Yeah, I would say they're wrong.
Objectively wrong?
No.
So it's just based on your preference.
I would say they're
prefer if the Holocaust. I know that's a little dramatic, but it sounds like it's more of a preference.
I would say that my value system states, and again, being the operating off of the goal-orientedness of value systems in general and how they motivate behavior and provide reasons and stuff like that. Yeah, I would say I stringently disagree. I would say objectively they misunderstood evolutionary theory.
So is your value system an objective authority that humans should follow?
No. So
why should we follow it?
Because you may prefer it as well. That your value system.
What if I don't?
What? Well, this is the nature of human conflict, isn't it? Like this, all the way down to religious disagreement within denominations of Christianity. It is exactly what we see, which is why I think anti-realism. I'm at least today persuaded that anti-realism is more likely of the two, because we don't see this kind of agreement, right? We can't just say, oh, it's just because here we are fighting about different value systems that are completely irreconcilable.
Sure. David, where I see the difficulty in the application of anti-realism is when something happens to me personally. I'm going to say, okay, you're there with your girlfriend, right? You guys live together. Let's say she disrespects you in something that she says to you, something like that. Mm-hmm. I find it hard to believe that you are going to say to her, hey, in my opinion, you disrespected me. I think you're going to say you should not, or you ought not have talked to me that way. If she were to, I don't know, something, I don't know, think something bad that she could do to you.
Go easy, man. Go easy.
I don't want to give her any idea.
Well, here's the if I can respond to that, I think I understand where you're going.
Well,
do you have more you wanted to add? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just had a little more I wanted to add. That in terms of like living this anti-realism out, if you say you should not have treated me this way,
Mm-hmm.
and then she says, yes, I should have, who's right and who's wrong here?
What do
And
you
how do I hold her? How do you hold her accountable for your personal preferences?
This to me, this is the function of moral outrage, because you're trying to you're looking for support essentially by saying you did this horrible thing. Say she just walks up to me and just cold cocks me, just slaps me
Sure.
across the face.
Sure.
I could be hurt. I can demonstrate my moral outrage at her behavior. Now, and by doing so, I'm trying to appeal to a common value between us that it's not okay to just go around hitting people, right?
Sure, but are you?
But if you
are
don't
you
have
gonna
that value, what
Right.
what use is that?
But right, sure. But what I'm asking you is this: are you going to tell her? Are you going to give her your opinion that she shouldn't have hit you? Or are you going to say, under no circumstances should you have come up to me and just slapped me in my face? You were absolutely objectively wrong for that.
I agree. All of that except for those last few words. It's not objectively wrong. What you did is wrong to me in a way that's going to create consequences for you potentially. Like if she just keeps coming up to me and slapping me for no reason because she feels like that's okay to do, we're going to break up. Like
Right, but that still sounds like a preference, not like.
Yeah, I mean,
it's still an appeal to a value system.
Would there be a situation where that was acceptable? I'm assuming your answer is no there.
Yeah.
Then
for the record.
Then I feel like
so I guess that's just the difficulty that I'm having is how do I live this out? This idea that it's all personal preference.
There's an appeal to it's because it's not just that, because you don't just see people who on the daily, they just think it's great to just go around slapping people because they feel like it. You don't. Those people are in jail generally, right?
But what about those who do?
Oh, there are cultures.
They're in jail.
Absolutely. No.
But why are they in jail?
You're thinking about the United States.
Or you're living in Saudi Arabia, right? I mean,
well,
it's a whole world out here.
But I guess
the whole rabbit trail there.
Right. But I guess what I'm talking about here is, okay, so on a general basis, you may not go around just slapping people on a daily basis. But what about those who do? They receive punishment.
Mm-hmm.
If this is all a matter of personal opinion, how do we justify the punishment because you violated a personal preference of mine?
Because it's not just personal opinion. It is normatively shared within the culture. Whatever the more is, whatever the rule is, whatever that shared value is, you're having one person who's stepping out. Basically, that's why they're getting punished.
So if someone was acting out of the normative, they're just being unfashionable at the end of the day. They're not really wrong.
Well, again,
like it's really like wearing.
To me, it's really wrong. Not objectively, but still really wrong.
It sounds a lot like you agree. Am I wrong? Because it sounds like they're not really doing anything wrong. They're just acting unfashionable based on the general herd morality. I mean, that's where I'm trying to understand the concept here.
So that's it's like splitting a hair, the way I'm trying to describe this, and it's very easy to lose the nuance. So if I'm appealing to a value system that is shared by most people regarding most topics, right? And we're all operating within this domain, it's really wrong within that value system. Not objectively in reality to anybody who doesn't share that value system, but it's like the rules of chess. Like we sit down to play a game of chess and you decide that you can move your pawn up, 6 places and across the board and take my king and you win. Like, no, you're not playing chess correctly. In chess, these are the rules of chess. Within the value system within our society, normatively, most of these things, there are rules, and you can be objectively right and wrong within that system, but that doesn't mean that system itself is objectively true.
Okay, so let's kind of keep this game thing. This game
again, what's true within the set is not necessarily true in all of the cosmos, essentially, right? That's what I'm trying to say.
Sure. So, okay, so I mean, we can
objectively.
Well, sure. Let's just keep it. Let's just keep it here on Earth then. I think the only way that you get to any moral absolutes is if there is a purpose to life.
I mean, and by that you mean objective purpose.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, objective purpose to life. If there is no objective purpose to life, then this idea that there's a code of conduct that is objectively true or objectively false, it's really not. It's essentially my morality is made up, or it's contingent upon each individual. Like, you know, maybe it sounds like that's kind of the where you align. Or it could be culturally based. You know, in this culture, we walk around slapping people, and this one we don't. It's okay to slap people here. You won't go to prison. You slap somebody over here, you're going to prison. Or maybe it's the power elite who define what right and wrong is. But if the fourth option would be if there's an eternal God who gave us the, you know, who created life and gave us.
I need to get to that, but go ahead.
It just sounds like, to me, the only way that you can tell me I can't just take my pawn and take your king right away is because there's a purpose to the game.
Rules.
And
not a purpose to the game, there is a purpose to the game.
Yeah, there is a purpose to the game. And so, and the purpose to the game, the rules are derived from that purpose. And so if I do something that violates the rules based on the purpose of the game, you can say, hey, that's wrong because this is the purpose of the game and this is how it's played.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
So Jaylen, I actually agree with of the line of thinking that you're going down there. We might have different religious beliefs, but I'm following you all the way there. I wanted to kind of chime in, and if I could just, excuse me for having to read this part here, but there's a book called Common Morality by Bernard Gert. If you're interested, it's
Bernard Gert.
I'll write it down.
Super relevant to what we're talking about right now. Okay. But I'm just going to mention something that he says. He's written many books about morality, where it comes from, through different societies, whether it's a natural evolution or whether or not it's religious based. Really interesting guy. He has a lot of his stuff online for free. But anyway, here's the thing that he says. He says, although both of the views are correct, both of which you're just talking about, either there's one sense of morality or there's, various views. He says that they're both correct in their appraisal of the other, but it doesn't count in their favor. The common sense and correct view is that although all rational people will agree on answers to most moral questions, they do not need to agree on all of them. And it's shown by the tolerance of those that are not extremists with regard to people who hold different views on controversial topics. It talks about common morality being something that rational people use implicitly to make their own decisions and judgments on how they ought to behave. It says it not only claims the overwhelming agreement concerning most moral decisions and judgments, but also explains why there's some unresolvable moral disagreement. He says that for all people, whether they're egoists concerned with only for their friends and family, or whether they're concerned for everyone, it is rational for all people to want everyone to obey rules such as do not kill, do not deceive, and keep your promises, regards to themselves and to others. And it need not be a system that people adopt as a guide for their own behavior. It's a system that rational people put forward as a public guide for behavior for everyone who can understand it and guide their behavior by it as a moral agent. So I just think that if we think about that, we don't have to agree on necessarily where it came from, but that as a society, we have a common morality that talks about we don't kill babies. Like we don't.
I think that says it. Obviously, this person's an author. They said it so much better than the way I've been trying to express it. That we do operate within a shared morality because it's based off of a shared value system on almost all topics, right? And that's why we have, we can live in a society that is relatively peaceful, right? That there is relative stability within our society. I mean, obviously, there's counterexamples to that, but because we operate in this, and whether or not we're appealing to something that we believe is an objective source, subjective source, or anything else, we're all doing ultimately the same thing, right?
Yeah, and
so that's part of it. And I wanted to get to one other thing. Remembering sort of my my take on God is somebody who could could make more realism possible, essentially, because I don't think that's the case. You could say, well, God has that, because this isn't stance independent. It is stance dependent by definition.
Could you elaborate more on what you mean by stance independent?
I guess the analogy I brought kind of at the beginning, I know there's a lot of chaos. Saying if there's a rock on the ground, it stands independent, that there is a rock on the ground. It is a fact of reality. It is a feature of reality that this thing is what it is. It's measurable. It has these atoms. There's a certain number of electrons spinning around in it.
May I throw a question in here?
Sure.
While you're talking about this, how'd the rock get there?
That is an entirely different conversation. This goes back to the origins of the universe kind of thing.
I know, but I think that matters, because
it does matter, and it's worth talking about. It is just so wildly different than the conversation that we're having. I am happy to have that conversation.
I was actually going to tie it into the conversation that we're having right now, because to me, the rock isn't stance. It isn't stance. You said stance dependent.
Independent. For something to be objective, it has to be stance independent.
Right. To me, that rock would be stance independent, because that rock would have had to, maybe it fell from somewhere. It was somewhere else before. Maybe it was kicked over to this spot in the ground where I can see it. Like in my mind, as it relates to what we're talking about with morality, morality can't be stance independent. It has to come from a mind in order for it to be real.
That's my argument, though.
Real beyond, right. And so I guess my question is, these moral absolutes that we seem to conduct ourselves by, these shared values that you're talking about, they had to have originated in a mind prior to us.
I don't agree with that. Okay, so let me back up to the rock thing. So I'm saying it's either, whether or not however it got there, right? It's either there or it's not. That's what I mean by stance independent.
Right.
Like, it is just true or it's just false. It is,
I don't think he's I don't think he's misunderstanding what you're saying there. Just to correct me if I'm wrong, Jaylen, but what he's saying is, like, the rock had to get there somewhere, just like our morals had to come from somewhere. So whether or not it was God's mind or insert whatever else you want to believe mind, someone had to come up with the original concept to socialize everyone else in the future. So I think, is that what you're trying to say, Jaylen?
That's exactly where I'm getting at. I'm getting at that morality can't be stance independent. It had to originate from a mind.
Right. And so to me, that by definition makes it non-objective.
Because God would be a mind, therefore it's
God would be a
subjective.
mind, has a stance, has a position, has an opinion, will, nature, any of these ways of slicing it. I'm glad to see the light bulb go off in your head.
So I guess the big problem I have with that is this is using a really specific and particular definition of mind. And forgive me, this is kind of a big thought, so roll with me here. It's definitely not the classical definition of a mind used by the philosophers and theologians that were defining the subject. This pretty much unanimous agreement is that God's mind is not like yours. He doesn't think about things. He doesn't consider things. He's eternal and unchanging. And I feel like the argument has like a hidden premise by some means. Like, it's a non sequitur to argue that because one has a mind, he necessarily has opinions. Opinions, of course, are deemed subjective and can be discussed among peers. When empirical evidence is presented, knowledge is gained. The all-knowing and peerless creator of the universe can have no opinions, as he only knows all true propositions, including moral ones, if they exist. Furthermore, if God exists, then morality isn't a matter of divine opinion. It's a matter of how God or how he created the world. Right and wrong are embedded in the fabric of the theistic universe. Killing innocent persons being wrong is like down being the directions all things fall. It's just how things are, because his mind is what created the universe, and nothing exists without it being upheld by his mind. Your mind is just among many others. Someone might say, well, God has a mind, I have a mind, we're both subjective. It's the difference between like a foundation for a house and a dinner plate that exists in the kitchen. You know, the dinner plate is completely subjective. It is not essential. It is disposable and only holds up something temporarily, which is itself disposable as well. But the entire house only exists because of the foundation underneath the house. And the house is entirely dependent upon the foundation. And, you know, scripture talks about how God is the creator and sustainer of all things. And so this concept of mind, God having a mind, even though he is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, it's definitely not the same by any means, because being omniscient wouldn't mean he just has a feeling about something.
Right.
It would be a thing that is objectively true, because that is what's in the fabric of the universe.
Okay, so lots to unpack there, and I can tell you were reading for something.
You mentioned it our last session about God being a mind, therefore he's subjective, and I thought about it a little bit.
God having, again, I think that's why I try to use like a mind, opinion, will, nature. I try to use these like synonymously without like driving too hard into whether or not God is a mind, has a mind, all these things. It is some kind of consciousness though, right? It is aware of itself and everything in reality.
I feel like in 21st century, we're thinking about minds and electronic devices and like the same thought. Where in previous generations, they're more inclined to think of universal laws and minds in the same frame of thought, which is much more of a classical theistic definition of that.
But if God is whether it's however you want to, and I don't want to say this in a way that is objectionable, because it's not so much about the verbiage as so much as what I'm trying to get across, and I may not be doing that perfectly. But if God says something is sin, right? There's whatever the thing is a sin. It's stating a position on something, right?
Sure.
That's, you know, and that's
sure.
So if he's doing that to me, that is the same thing as taking a stance, which is why I like that kind of definition of being either stance independent or stance dependent. It's dependent on God's position regarding whatever that action is, as calling it sin. So to me, again, by definition, this is so like divine command theory, that is a subjective stand. It's because it meets up with God's will or nature. And we can say, and again, I understand that God's mind is not like our own, but to me, that doesn't escape sort of the function of how these terms work.
Well, I think the biggest difference, and then I'll let Jaylen go because I know he's itching to go, is I'm subjective because my opinions can change. I can have different thoughts and ideas. And when I come across new knowledge, I might change my opinion. When I'm a little baby, I might think stealing is okay or something. And we come to that knowledge and realize, oh, crap, that's not okay. That's not good, you know? And so when we have an omnipotent and omniscient source, he knows all things. And so he can't really come to new knowledge to have a new opinion or something. It just is what it is. It's in the fabric of the universe and is based on how the universe was created, not along with only the fine tuning, but that moral values for humans exist. And I think that's the big difference between a subjective human having opinions based on being able to interpret new information as opposed to an omnipotent, omniscient source.
Jaylen, before you jump in,
sure.
What makes that good or moral? That God is taking a position, being omniscient and everything else that you said. What makes that position morally right? What is it about his nature that makes it morally right?
Well, when we're talking about
because the danger here, and I'll let you know so I don't feel like you're walking into it. I'm laid a trap for you or something like that. Sure. The things that I'm concerned about are tautology, is that God is good because we define him as good. That carries A, no explanatory power, and B, there's a naturalistic fallacy that may or may not, that I believe strongly is probably at play here by saying that it is God's will or nature to be morally perfect. Well, what makes that any different than saying God is like himself? And I don't know if that's good or bad. We're just defining it that way. That's sort of the big objection that I would have.
Sure. Well, when we're talking about a all-knowing, transcendent being, it's almost kind of difficult for us to talk about that first and foremost because of the fact that we're talking.
Sure.
Yeah, we're talking about an infinite being. We're finite beings. We're talking about someone who exists outside of space, matter, and time. We are very much confined by that. when we're talking about that, I think it's important to highlight that this idea of him being all good is not necessarily derived from our explanation of him being good, but it's derived from our observation of what he created first and foremost. And then also when you're talking about this all-powerful, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, intelligent being, I would think that when we get to that level of being, you have the right to define what's good and what's not. When we're talking about someone who created the universe, because the reality is this: somebody's defining it, whether it be him or just us. It's being defined. So you know, I don't necessarily have an issue if we did call God good, but what I guess what gives what gives it ground to stand on, our observation, is the fact that we're talking about the creator of the universe. And also, I guess when you kind of get into the Christian worldview, this creator of the universe has revealed himself to us through the person of Christ, that he is good, and he revealed that to us, that he's good.
But
so it's not like we're just calling him good to call him good. It's what he revealed to us, much like your girlfriend revealed to you that she liked you, she was interested in you, and you revealed to her that you liked her, you were interested in her. You know, but it took you to open up and show that, and for her to accept whatever you revealed, and then to make observations about it, and then act accordingly to what she observed.
Okay. I would say that there's probably a lot of things presupposed in stating that way with regards to, say, the goodness of God, right? You could be omniscient, like you can grant omniscience, timelessness, omnipresence and all that stuff. And it's hypothetical, we're obviously not talking about the God of the Bible necessarily, and could be perfectly malevolent. You've heard before of like Cartesian demons or something like that that's created us with delusions about life and reality and everything else that could have created all for the purpose of maximizing suffering. If you think about the way I look at the fine tuning of the universe, it's fine tuned for suffering and death. We tread on earth upon mountains of things that have died and suffered before they died before us, right? That this could all be in terms of maximization. And if he still defined himself as perfectly good, and by good he means suffering and death, I would have no way to differentiate that between a different kinds of God. I mean, obviously scripture is going to indicate some differences here, but again, scripture's written by men. To remain within that hypothetical though, if it was something else, how would I know whether or not that matches what my concept of good is, or my understanding of what good is, whether it's objective, subjective, or anything else? How do I know what that standard is really good, other than just by asserting it on definition?
Sure. Dylan, you have anything you want to add to this?
I'm trying to interpret your view. So are you saying you don't have a way to verify
how do we know God is good?
Well, I mean, for one, you were defining good as the propitiation of humans. Is that correct?
No, it's my value system that is something that is again shared, but part of my value system that this is better for, that flourishing makes myself and others, have a better mental and physical state. That is something that I value. I mean, I'm calling that good.
Your value. Good. Oh, I apologize. I wasn't trying to cut you off there.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm done. Go ahead.
So I guess I guess you'd have to evaluate your value system and apply it accordingly. I don't want it to put every person in the seat as judge all the time. But I guess the big thing is you're trying to figure out, how do I know if God is good? And I'm trying to use your definition of good, which is propitiation of the human species. And if you look all over scripture, I mean, I have to love my neighbor and I have to love my enemies. That sounds like propitiation of human species. I have to respect women. I have to respect people of all color and nationality. It is not just like a cute guideline. I'm directly commanded to do these things. I shouldn't kill. I shouldn't steal. All of these sort of things. These all sound like things that are propitiation for the human species. So if we're using scripture to validate how you're defining good in your value system, it seems like it follows pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and I would honestly expect that, given naturalism. And again, and that's not necessarily to exclude, given Christianity or theism in general, but I just see so much commonality in value systems that we call a lot of things good. I have no reason to need to defend that as being
it's almost
objectively
as
good.
if the objective moral law is written on our hearts, and we all know it deep down. It's not just an opinion or a preference.
I don't think that's really demonstrable. Again, because we'd have to go back an hour in the conversation to get back to that. So I'll just say that, and we can move on. Jaylen, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, I think Dylan kind of hit it on the head when he talked about the propitiation of the human species. But I think one thing he, I won't say left out, but I think to complete the statement is that God is very much interested in the propitiation of the human race, but for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose, in the summary, is to know God and love and know God, be in relationship with Him, and to love, know, and be in relationship with each other. And so God is very much interested in keeping the human race around. When you read the Bible itself, there were several instances where really bad things could have happened to people groups or different things like nature, but God constantly protected and preserved people groups because He is very much interested in keeping humans around. Okay. But then the question becomes, why?
Sure. And again, it's His purpose.
Yes.
This indicates a stance, right? That's kind of what it goes back to. And the other thing I was going to say,
and there's nothing wrong with
my
that.
value system. No, I don't think there is either. I just don't think that's a realist position. And again, that should cost you nothing to say that is kind of really the thrust of the argument. This doesn't, debunk God's existence or anything like that. Oh. I think the very common, the boilerplate, like apologetic, counter-apologetic arguments about morality is all a misstep. I've listened to a couple of debates recently, and I actually don't know the worldview of everybody involved. But it was just an academic conversation about realism and anti-realism to help suss out what is this really the case of, without trying to weaponize it as, oh, well, in your position, it's this and all these horrible things. In your position is just another opinion and all this. And one could say that about the other in this conversation today. I guess I'm kind of seeking to get past that, but I just think it's true, like ontologically speaking, that we're not talking about a realist position. It sounds to me like the God is instantiating from his own position, which makes it not a realist position, and it's one that my value system agrees with.
So let me.
So I could say in that sense, or well, not entirely, but in large proportion agrees with. And again, it depends on your interpretation of scripture and doctrine and things like that.
I think it's abundantly clear what the purpose to life is as far as scripture goes. But Dylan,
okay,
yeah, I was just gonna say. So it seems like you, on no stance, agree that God could be objective. Is that true?
I think I allow. I mean, I've spent almost 2 hours defending anti-realism, but kind of prior to that, I would say, that moral realism may be true, but it doesn't hinge on the existence of God. Because again, if it stands independent, if there's just a moral standard, it is just moral facts based on, it's. Again, if morality is the game of human flourishing, right, in the analogy to chess, and making life better for people and mitigating suffering and so on and so forth, if we can all agree that is just objectively what morality is, that there is an objective right or wrong, that doesn't hinge at all on whether or not God created the universe. Because it's just true.
Right, and we're not here to debate whether or not God exists. It's just about what's a more plausible source. And so my question is, if let's just say hypothetically, I don't take this view, but God was not objective, but in fact, he was subjective, it seems like the viewpoint that you have. So let's hypothetically take that stance for a second. Why? I don't see how that would really matter on whether or not we would have objective morals. And the reason why I feel this is because, for one, if we were to have someone choose objective morals,
Mhm.
who would I rather pick? Someone who is just as subjective and egoic and selfish as I am, and it's going to go what's best for me or for perpetuation of my tribe or whatever, or someone who is outside of the universe, an objective source, or excuse me, we're not using objective because he's subjective in this analogy. I don't know why you wouldn't have someone who is supreme in knowledge, omniscient, omnipotent. I don't see how his opinions wouldn't inflict us by any means. And I just don't see how that would really be a pushback on that being the source of objective moral values. Sure, it might be his opinion that these things are good on this hypothetical, but it still doesn't change the source of where they come from by any means.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I don't have any pushback to that, because if we're saying that God is operating from a stance, he has a certain value system, and certain positions on certain things. Some things are sins, some things are not, and he's omniscient and all powerful and things like that. Like, pretty trusted authority in that sense. If that being the case, I wouldn't say that's necessarily objectionable, and that doesn't weigh to me one way or another whether or not God exists. Like, I'm fine with that, in short.
Right, and again, it's not about whether or not God exists in this conversation, just to clarify, about what's a more plausible source or explanation for morality. And so whether he's objective or, the view I don't uphold, subjective, it doesn't really change that foundation. And so I guess just because we're getting close to 2 hours, just to kind of bring to a summation point, I haven't really seen a lot of foundational aspects on why atheism would better explain morality when we seem to have a very clear one on theism. And so if we're only defining good as the propitiation of life, we're defining good as propitiation of life. Okay, why is propitiation of life good? Because we've defined it that way. Then we just have propitiation of life is propitiation of life. And to me, that doesn't really make sense. And on the other aspect, I don't see why we would prefer humans, especially when we cause so much turmoil and distress to the planet. Why couldn't one just kill the human race off and allow all of the other thousands of species thrive instead? You know what I mean? I just don't see any ways you could objectively, other than laws, but those aren't objective sources, to really enforce these sort of things of objective morality, or these just general things that you seem to agree that they are self-evident and people agree with. But I guess it's tricky because the anti-realist position saying that there is no really right or wrong moral move as long as it's going in this direction. But like I said, I feel like the definition doesn't work because it's kind of circular.
Okay, well, there's a massive amount to unpack there, but to kind of revisit just the kernel, because we are coming up on 2 hours, of whether or not God or naturalism, really, because again, atheism by itself doesn't explain much of anything.
Right.
Naturalism is the better explanation. It comes down to the parsimony of the explanation. That which is less parsimonious to me, and this is an invocation of Bayes' theorem, that sort of the more elements that are required in terms of explanation of something, the less, the lower the probabilities of that thing are, and makes it the less likely between alternatives. To me, the idea that there is an indifferent universe that produced thinking creatures as a result of naturalistic processes, to me seems to be more explanatory and more parsimonious than proposing this eternal, timeless, all the characteristics that we propose to God, and then having to cash out each one of those properties of God, and then saying God did this for this reason and purpose. To me, that doesn't, again, that's not saying it's necessarily false, but to me, that seems less likely.
But to use the concept of the more variables makes it more probabilistically unlikely. Is that correct? It seems like quite the opposite, because it seems like we have one source and one property that we are using to govern this sort of system of morality, as opposed to seemingly complex evolutionary theory and social constructs and all these sort of things. And like I said, this still doesn't give us a source of morality. It just tells how we might have discovered it or crafted it. And so, right. In fact, I feel like you kind of argued the opposite with that, because in fact, it would make it way more probabilistic, because it's just one thing that we're talking about, as opposed to a numerous amount of different factors that have to craft in a certain way over a millennia of evolution, especially if we're going back to a single common ancestor up until the human race. Now it seems like way more factors.
There's an interesting point.
No, I mean,
I
you have
like
to
it.
high five him for that.
Yeah, I got to high five you for that. The one caveat I would put on that is kind of the one caveat I would put on that is, in order for God to have explanatory power, you have to cash out all of these characteristics that God has and provide a motivation. Why did God create the universe? Why does he give us purpose? You have to explain each and every one of those factors. To me, this kind of comes down to opinion, honestly, as to which one sounds more reasonable.
But that's just
as a naturalist,
understanding. That's just understanding the source. That's not more variables. That's just understanding the one source. Where in actuality, again, the same point, you would have to understand evolutionary theory. You'd have to understand this process from, 6 billion years ago from a single cell organism all the way to now, and understand why for a super big tree. You have to also understand why social constructs the way it is. And I'm sure your girlfriend can give you a big old 50-hour debate on sociology about this concept. And so, yeah, exactly. And
don't do it now. Don't do it now.
No, not today. Not today.
But and again, it seems like the opposite is kind of argued, where this giant variable thing is way more on the naturalist plate than the theist. We have one, and we can understand that more, but that's just one thing, not a billion, we'll just say, thing.
Okay, well, my pushback here, and again, we'll just have to close it because we're ultimately not going to agree that the one thing you're proposing is it's like me saying, well, the naturalistic process, that's one thing, right? Well, no, there's a lot of factors within that naturalistic process that why is there something rather than and all these other things. The same kind of components. These are things that we attribute by definition to God. Well, why are we saying God is omnipotent or timeless or spaceless or all these other things? Those are still properties that you have to catch, because it could have been otherwise, that the universe could have been created by some kind of deity that is only sufficiently powerful to have created their universe and then died in the process or went away, or the flying spaghetti monster or Cthulhu, or some other kind of Cartesian demon.
With Christian apologetics is, what does the evidence point towards? And is Scripture a reliable account of the revelation of the personhood of Jesus Christ, God incarnate? And of course, we're not here to argue the existence of God, but what's a more plausible source? And all of the evidence, at least compared to any other religion, all points to Christianity. And so, again, understanding the concept of God and who He is still just one source. It might be a complicated source on some capacity. But I mean, we have binded this library of information of these 66 or 72 books if you're Catholic, of information on this source entity and the revelation he had when he came down and lived a human life to be a great Rabboni or teacher. And so, again, I just don't see, it seems like it's a much bigger implausibility on the naturalistic side as opposed to the theistic side, if we're using the argument of variables and probability.
Can I say something?
Yes, please do. And then we got to wrap.
I swear, I've been itching to talk for so long.
Sure. She was pinching me earlier.
I was.
Like, is it time to go? She's like, let me talk.
Yes, I don't want to interrupt, but I'm like, if you don't stop talking.
This is not the first time I've gotten that look.
So, I mean, it kind of just sounds like everyone's just summing up their viewpoint, and you were never going to come to this phone call or this recording and agree at the end of it. It just wasn't going to happen. You come from two different viewpoints.
We know that. Yep.
But I think one of my notes here, so I don't think that the common morality has to be derived necessarily from theism or evolutionary descent. I don't think it has to be one or the other. Whatever fancy word that means, realism, whatever. I don't really get into all the fancy words. Sure. That's his gym. I think that I'm more in agreement with Gert's common morality there, that if I could use your prior example of using stealing as wrong, that neither of your views are objective exactly, that if we're using Christian theism, that it...
Sorry, go ahead.
What did you just say?
I said anti-realism and I pointed at you.
I don't know, whatever that means. So Christian theism imposes that stealing is wrong and delivers that as a moral fact. So God says you shouldn't steal, right? We believe that. That's in the Bible. That's the way we go. But evolutionary, if we look at that aspect, we could say that from a hunter-gatherer taking food, stealing food would be met with it would be a challenge to their survival. And so they'd be met with a negative reaction, condemnation, which is how people are socialized, how we define what's good or bad in our society, and then pass that on over the entire span of the length of evolutionary growth. Apply that taking food item to literally anything else. We've learned as a society, we don't steal. Now, maybe God, any God, I don't know, insert any sort of deity there. Maybe they instilled that human with, the knowledge that they need to protect their food source. I don't know. Or maybe it's just an evolutionary fact within our genetics that we know that we have to eat, so we fight for our food, and food was scarce in the beginning. So I think that neither of you have to strictly disagree with the other. And I think that if you had the time, picking up Gert's book or looking it up online would be a really interesting
I got it on my tab already as soon as you said
There you
it.
go.
Awesome.
I'm going to check it out.
Sweet.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Yep.
Okay, that's it. My 2 cents.
Do you guys
Cool,
want to
cool.
do
That was mine.
I mean, that
I get it off. David, since it's your podcast, did you want to go last? Do you want to go next?
I'll go last. I don't really have much to say, but you go ahead
Sure.
next.
Jaylen, you or me? Up to you.
I'll just say, first of all, it's been a pleasure talking to you, man, once again. And Janie, I've enjoyed you as well. Thanks for joining us on this conversation. It's shameless plug. Like I said earlier, just be on the lookout. We're about to actually start recording for our own podcast as well, the Identity Crisis podcast. Like and subscribe to us on YouTube. We're about to start dropping our own content, things like that. And maybe David we'll have you on.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
For us, man. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity. I've enjoyed the conversation. And Dylan, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess closing statements in terms of again, fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah.
I always love talking about this sort of stuff and talking with people that can actually have a fluent and coherent and respectful conversation about things, even when we disagree vastly on something. So I appreciate your guys' kind candor and just having us on the show. I very much appreciate it. I guess closing statements in terms of especially the Common Morality book. I guess the main grievance I have is the concept of ontology versus epistemology. And I definitely don't disagree of how we've come to that knowledge. But I think based on the conversation today, I haven't really seen a good foundation for objective morality or these more social constructs, however we want to word it, from a naturalistic point of view. And I just think it's more plausible from a theistic framework. But like I said, that's just kind of my last couple of thoughts on that. And again, thank you so much for having us on the show. And of course, I will double the shameless plug that we're actually going to start recording next week. And we're hoping to drop episodes twice a month talking about these sort of things. And if it helps, because we got a little bit into whether or not God exists in this, our first episode is going to be, does God exist? So
It's a fair place to start.
That is a very fair place for
might
an
as well.
apologetic.
The
Yeah.
elephant.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dylan, if I could just insert this, when you look up Gert, he has a follow-up book to Common Morality,
Okay.
and where it's like morality, naturalistic something. But he actually talks about, he was like, in Common Morality, I made a mistake. I learned something. I've changed my opinion. Here's this. And so anyway,
Is
there's
it
that.
like an addendum or like an extension of the book or something?
It's like a sequel almost. It's not quite as long, but
Okay.
they're both published by Oxford. They're worth looking at.
Man, David, if you could send that link to me and I could listen to that, because if it's on
Yes.
Audible, I'm listening to it on Monday.
Yeah,
so.
I'll look it up, and I assume that you're on Facebook, so I will look you up and I will send you a message.
Cool.
I greatly
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah,
it.
please,
I love
please do.
Yeah,
Send-
I'll have to check that out too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot to learn for all of us. To me, I guess in my own closing, this is less about proving one over the other. That I just want to engage in the pure discussion of what is, and kind of hash these things out in a kind of collegiate and friendly kind of way,
Sure.
which I think we all did a fantastic job at. And again, I am the person. I think the last time I basically said that I'm like agnostic as to with regards to realism, anti-realism,
Sure.
and like like I said, yesterday kind of got pushed over to the anti-realism. I may go back at some point. I don't know. And again, I'm going to have to, consider these arguments and the flaws and pitfalls and things like that kind of to each side. I think some of the things that I said hold true and not in an attacking way regarding realism and anti-realism, regarding our worldviews on that. Because one, I don't think it pushes the needle really at all in one direction or another. And I do agree that whatever this thing is, we're agreeing on most of it already across societies, that our value systems remain not entirely, but in large proportion consistent across time and culture, that we see a lot of the same things. Obviously, there are very significant exceptions to that, but we're all basically doing the same thing and then fighting about, oh, this is objective, this is subjective, so we can just dismiss it. Like, that's not, none of us live that way. None of us really behave that way. And if it turns out that moral realism is true, I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a dog in the fight. And I think a lot of the arguments between Christians and atheists, especially online, revolve around that. Well, if there's no God, then everything's just whatever, and you can do whatever you want, and we should all just be sociopaths. That's not how anybody lives, and there's really compelling reasons to understand and accept that. And it's that, and as apologists and guys, that's not going to be a compelling argument for anybody at all, that, oh, I need to be a Christian now because otherwise, all of my morals are just feelings and opinions and it doesn't matter. Like, that's never going to work for anybody. Really, and I know, well, clarify. I've seen it kind of.
Well, that's not what the official apologists usually do to make that argument. No one, because in fact, you and I probably have a lot of similar moral values. Again, it's not about epistemology, how you came to that knowledge, but ontology, where does that knowledge come from? And that's where the moral argument comes from, at least from a scholarly, apologetic argumentation for the existence of God. Just to clarify, but I mean, people misuse arguments all the time.
I know, and there's, I mean, what I talked on our last discussion, talked about all kinds of terrible atheist arguments, and the lack theism and all that other stuff. Like, I'm not with them, and I'm not saying that those people are you or you're responsible for what other people are saying, but these are things that are common, and having conversations like this is a good way, I think, to end those kinds of conversations, to help educate people past them into, again, something that's not as sort of cantankerous and tribalistic, which is what this all becomes weaponized philosophy at some point, if you let it. And that's what I'm trying to move us away from. Again, I think we did a fantastic job tonight. If you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook. Check out the Fermenting Opinions channel, like, subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications when we go live. This will be a podcast episode, proper MP3 format on iTunes, Beyond Pod, wherever else you get your podcast listening on. Give me a week or two, guys. I'm so exhausted. It's been a hell of a couple of weeks for me.
Get some sleep, man.
Yeah, man. I'm going to get some sleep after this. Dylan and Jaylen, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I want to keep doing this. I love these conversations. I was exhausted and I'm so energized right now. I can't even explain it. This is so fun to me. But yeah, you guys, again, take care. Thank you. I'm David Propiden. This is Fermenting Opinions, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, guys.
See you guys.